Hi there, Nic here. Don't worry, I'm not flying solo. Damian will be joining me later. This is a slightly different episode of the SKADI Podcast. We're always looking for new ways to explore our love of finance and the controls that support the industry. We love to try different ways to engage the growing number of listeners who found us and decided to stay. Well, this episode is a first because we've gone out of the studio and, using a technical term, done an outside broadcast. We've also done this in a couple of places, West Sussex and the City of London. This is because we've woven a number of threads together to talk about the Lloyds Names. In West Sussex, we take a look at one of the Lloyds Names, Admiral Richard Fitch, who, facing investment losses year after year, in 1994 ended his own life. This has poignancy for me as his son 5 years earlier was in my year at school. In the City of London, we look back at the history of Lloyds, how it came to be, and how the world-renowned institution has evolved. If you work in wholesale finance or asset management and are wondering whether a podcast about Lloyds and insurance is really for you, stay with us. Because though the Lloyds Names scandal took place over 30 years ago, as Damian and I have found, there are lessons to be learned which are as poignant today for everyone working in the business of finance, dealing with sensitive information, customers that need significant care, and managing conflicts of interest. Right, enough from me. We hope you enjoy this look back at the Lloyds Names. Okay, just one more thing. If you enjoy the SKADI Podcast, then why not join our Discord community? There's a treasure trove waiting for you, including all the materials we used to create the SKADI Podcast. Click the link in the episode description to be part of the tribe. Right, go on. You can go and listen now. So walking now from Bognor Regis, as you walk towards the east, and as you get beyond Butlins and walk further on, and the promenade gives way to more of a coastal path, and you approach the residential area of Middleton-on-Sea, and I can see the houses to the left-hand side of me, behind a kind of typical sort of coastal scrub with pines and so on. But the houses, they're not over the top, but they're definitely desirable dwellings. Very middle class is, I think, the simplest way to describe them. And I can envisage that the Fitch family, thinking back into the 1990s, Richard Fitch, an admiral, he was a successful man. I believe he'd been the commander of the aircraft carrier, the Hermes, which was one of two, I think, aircraft carriers that the Royal Navy had at the time. So clearly a very, very able person, successful, but I wouldn't have expected someone in the armed forces to be earning a lot of money. They would have done okay, and it's that having enough income to look for some kind of investment to provide security in retirement that drew him and others like him, those kind of middle class people, into being a Lloyd's name. But it was a succession of hard hits that came at the end of the 1980s and the beginning of the 1990s that led Richard Fitch to be paying out over a series of years a consistent amount of about £100,000 each year. That was a significant amount of money to be paying out every year, and I think it got to a point for him and others like him that they were having to pay out similar amounts over the course of the next few years, that made him ultimately take the decision to take his own life. And I believe, reading into the circumstances, there were 30 or so people whose deaths were attributed to losses that they'd experienced as a result of being a Lloyd's name. From its humble beginnings in Lloyd's Coffee House in Tower Street in the 1680s, individuals have been the underwriters of risk at Lloyd's. In fact, individuals were the only source of underwriting until as recently as 1994. The names, as these individuals are known, conducted their underwriting with unlimited personal liability. There are some names around today who continue to do this, but after the loss experienced by names in the late 80s to mid-90s, many people either left the market or chose to convert to limited liability underwriting through special small companies known as namecos or Scottish limited partnerships. No new individual members have been admitted to the market since the 1st of January 2003. From that period on, individuals that want to enter the market have to do so by one of the limited liability vehicles available. So, stop one on our Lloyds Names podcast, and we're on the outside broadcast.
Yes, we are. This could be an interesting one.
This could be an interesting one.
Let's see how it works.
I can't remember if we've ever done an outside broadcast before.
Not in a podcast. I think we've done sort of short segments for LinkedIn, but definitely not.
But for the podcast, not necessarily.
We might turn out to be a good reason why we haven't. But anyway, let's give it a go.
Alexandra, the podcast guru, with us. Her hands are tied. There's no clapping going on.
No,
because it's not a Horizon episode. And off we go. So anyway, here we are. We're at St Dunstan's Hill. This podcast is about the Lloyds Names, but it would be pointless, I think, of trying to do a podcast about the Lloyds Names without actually exploring more about the history of Lloyds.
Absolutely. I think it's integral to the story and where we will get to, but I think that you absolutely need some scene setting, I suppose, and some back history to work out how it all came about.
I think that's exactly right, and well, Damian, that's the way my mind works. I can't do anything. I have to go back through the history. It's the timeline. It's the investigator in me. I have to build up a timeline. So we're going to build up the timeline. We're starting at the beginning.
We are.
And my first question to you, Damian, is: do you even know how the name of Lloyd's came about?
Well, I didn't till I did a bit of research.
Of course, exactly. So we've done our research.
But yeah, named after a person actually, who was Edward Lloyd, who set up here way back in 1686, very close to where we're standing. In fact, there's no blue plaques. We're sort of having a bit of a guess.
Well, and we say here. It's the environ, exactly. To be all cosmopolitan about it, multilingual SKADI. Because we know that the first site of Lloyd's coffee houses being so important in London after the Great Fire of London, which we know occurred 1666, you had the plague 1665.
Indeed, yeah.
And you had the rebuilding of London. And what's great about the site where we are now, which is the church on St Dunstan's Hill, and it's the ruins of it. And if you haven't been to this site, you really should go. It's a real kind of place of respite in a busy city. But the ruins of the church here. And this is a Christopher Wren church, because he was charged with obviously doing a lot of the rebuilding after the Great Fire of London. And it was round about these parts on Tower Street, and we've come into here from Great Tower Street, but we know from the old maps that Tower Street was around here. That somewhere here in 1686 or 1688, if you go by what's written down in Lloyd's Register. And again, what's great about this is it's not really confirmed when the coffee house was here, but his coffee house is where the first start of Lloyd's happened. And we're talking about sailors coming in off the ships. The Pool of London, a very deep water pool.
Yeah.
And if you want to know more about trade and the history of trade in London, look no further than Dominic Broom's episode of the podcast, who came in as a great guest, didn't he, Damian?
I think that's in the top 10, as in not between 1 and 10, rather than top 10. But obviously, Dom, if you're listening, the definite top 3 or 4.
It's in my top 10. It's in my top 10. Yes, no, top 10 of the most listened podcasts, but it was one of the early 10 because we recorded that during, it was one of the lockdown podcasts, one of the Zoom podcast episodes. But anyway, here we are. But I think we can go to a place with a lot more certainty, Damian.
We can, yes.
Which is the site that's much more recorded of where the coffee house moved to. So we'll move that in a little while. But I think the other thing we should reflect on also is that how different, we can hear the taxis going by. I don't know if they're going to make it through to the recording, but certainly we're above Lower Thames Street. And that possibly was, could have been where the extent of the river got to.
Yes, I was about to say, we've got a decent stretch before, then there's a huge building, and the river is on the other side of that. So the river is a good 50 metres, I'd say, from us, possibly even a bit more, where we stand now. But obviously the landscape of London would have been very different back then. So, I'm sure you'd have been closer to the water's edge here.
Great stuff. Well, why don't we head off now to
Lombard Street.
Yeah,
indeed.
Lombard Street, to the site that we do know, and it is recorded with a wonderful blue plaque. So we know what it is to be a name, but why would people want to become one? Aside of the obvious allure and kudos of being seen as someone of such considerable wealth and substance. Firstly, it's the ability to use your capital twice. Names were able to pledge assets that they owned as collateral against the risk they insured, while still receiving the returns from their portfolio. It's a way of significantly enhancing returns. The other attraction is tax treatment. Underwriting in the UK is considered to be a trade and is not considered to be an investment. This provides eligibility to key kinds of tax relief. The first one is business disposal relief, which reduces the impact of capital gains when you sell your trading business. There is also eligibility for business property relief, and this provides business owners with valuable relief from inheritance tax. This relief can be as much as 100%. So taking those two things into consideration and thinking that over the long term, as long as you know that your syndicate's underwriting team does their job and the premiums taken in should exceed the liabilities that you face and you make profits over time, then being a name is a very attractive proposition. So a quick stop on the way to Lombard Street because we're kind of ducking in between all the little alleyways, and of course we've come in front of an establishment we know well, Damian, don't we?
I've been here once or twice.
Yeah, the Jamaica Wine House, affectionately known as
the Jam Pot.
The Jam Pot. And there's a blue plaque here which says, "Here stood the first London coffee house at the sign of Pascal Rosé's head, 1652."
Yeah.
So interesting, actually, coffee houses so pre-Great Fire of London, but it was out of the ashes of the Great Fire of London that people came together in coffee houses to start doing business, start writing those contracts, start writing those transactions between each other. And as we know, as we've talked about on the SKADI Podcast many times, shipping and trade and London and coffee houses all inherently linked.
All linked together, yeah, absolutely.
Okay, onwards to Lombard Street.
To really understand what was going on at the time, and to understand why the Lloyds debacle became such a catastrophe for the new, more recently recruited names, we need to go under the hood and look at what was happening in some of the underwriting syndicates at Lloyds. While capacity at Lloyds was increasing with the addition of all these new names, underwriters looked to write more and more long-tail liability and catastrophe business in the form of what was known as excess loss or XL reinsurance. These underwriters in turn looked to retrocede, or in other words lay off, some of the amount reinsured to other reinsurers. Some syndicates doing XL reinsurance retroceded to other XL syndicates, so that instead of the risks being dispersed, they circulated around the same market. This, in conjunction with poor record keeping, meant that it became very difficult to tell what risks lay within each syndicate. Unscrupulous underwriters could also offload the worst risks onto what became known as dustbin syndicates of outsider names, while picking the best risks to be reinsured within internal Lloyds Names, so-called baby syndicates of insiders. We'll go into more detail later on the podcast about the lessons learned from this story, but suffice to say, the issues at Lloyd's at the time bring to mind two very relevant topics in today's markets, that of insider dealing and record keeping.
I think looking at, the circumstances of Richard Fitch, he had been looking for an income in retirement. That's what drew him to Lloyd's. And of course, retirement is a time where, you realise that your earning capacity is limited. It's not like you can go out and get into the workforce or return to the workforce. And of course, for him, he knew a life at sea. He would have known about managing people, of course, but it's not so easy just to return and of course take some kind of financial hit to have to return into the workforce. Would have been very, very difficult. He was born in 1929, so that's of course the year of the Wall Street crash, and he took his life in 1994, February the 15th, 1994. So he would have been around 64 years of age, and of course taking the kind of hits that he would have been taking year after year. You can see that would have been very, very demoralising at that time of life.
Names would join a syndicate for 1 year, the annual venture. Because it takes time for claims to be reported and paid, the annual venture had a 3-year accounting period. The method with which the books were closed at the end of the 3-year accounting period was by the purchase of a reinsurance to close policy. Often the syndicate that had disbanded would reform as a new syndicate, but with similar, or even the same, member names. The new forming syndicate would often be the seller of the reinsurance to close policy to the previous disbanding syndicate that many of its names had already been members of. In this way, premiums were rolled forward through the same syndicate into different years, but also the open exposures. It was possible, and also did happen, that reinsurance to close policies were traded outside of the syndicate, thus sending away some of the risk, but also some of the potential future profits. What many names new to the market didn't realise and were not aware of when joining a syndicate was the way in which they were exposed to long-term risks. This came to a head in the late 1980s, when long-term losses began to manifest, in the main related to asbestos-related claims from insurance policies written decades earlier for the US market.
So here we are in Lombard Street, and what's interesting to me, Damian, well, there's always a lot of things interesting to me, but Lombard Street I immediately associate with banking.
Yep, absolutely.
And yet here we are, right at the site of Lloyd's Coffee House, 1691. Until 1785.
So for a while.
I can read that off the plaque that's right between us both. And the plaque is bolted firmly onto the front of a Sainsbury's. I mean, how marvellous is that? Also, DT, I'm pretty sure this is the Sainsbury's where a young city gent was caught putting through all of his shopping over a number of months as loose onions. And the way he was caught, SKADI anti-fraud hat on, was because the store doesn't sell loose onions.
Oh.
So, yeah, so that's why we are. It's not why we are here, but an interesting fact about where we are in front of this Sainsbury's in Lombard Street. Anyway, when they did move to Lombard Street, and Edward moved his coffee house here, DT, tell us a little bit about that.
Well, they set up, I think, it's probably a good sort of 5-10 minutes walk, I'd say, so you've definitely moved away from the river here. But in the hub of London life, they set up a pulpit here in this building, and they would conduct auctions from it. So that would have been, I assume, stuff coming off the ships. You'd have an auction to see how it was sold. And one of the ways they would do that was something called a candle auction. And the usefulness of that is it has a random finish. So, you light a candle and you let it burn down, but no one actually knows when it's going to finish. So there is a sort of randomised element to when the auction might actually end. And actually, bizarrely, you still see that in auctions that we run even to this day. So looking at, for instance, the London Stock Exchange, they close on an auction. 5-minute auction, but there's a randomised element to it, which stops people trying to game that auction by just trying to force massive orders through right at the close.
So the point being that the candle, with its uncertain ending, when it might burn out, gives it that randomisation.
Exactly. Yeah.
But we still have randomisation. I love that about the SKADI podcast. When we did Tulip Mania and we learnt about the Dutch auction.
Yep.
It's nice sort of that these travels back through time reveal a little bit about market mechanisms. I do like that about it. Now, the coffee house stayed on this site for some time.
Yeah.
Before it moved literally across the road. Actually, this time we've gone quite away from the first site through a lot of the alleys just to get a bit of the kind of the feeling of the atmosphere. And we obviously just passed, one of the old coffee shops, the Jamaica wine house.
Well, we didn't stop for a glass of wine.
We didn't stop.
Tempting as it might be, but anyway.
Yes, but now we can go over to where Lloyd's changed also its setup, because it moved from being this kind of individual ownership to the Council of Lloyds.
Well, I think it's called the Society of Lloyds.
The Society of Lloyds.
And it was formed 1774, so actually just before it moved, looking down the plaque just to check when they moved it from here in 1785. So in 74 they would have set up the Society of Lloyds, but as you alluded to, they moved just over the road, in fact, to the Royal Exchange.
Let's go over. Let's get a bit of atmos from the Royal Exchange, right opposite the Bank of England.
So what exactly was the LMX spiral? We introduced excess loss policies back in the section on baby and dustbin syndicates. LMX just stands for London Market Excess of Loss. As we explained before, an insurer would get excess of loss reinsurance from another insurer. That reinsurer would then get their own reinsurance from someone else, and on it went, creating a dizzying spiral of interconnected contracts. Now, here's where things get tricky. When a big claim comes in, doesn't just hit one insurer, it would ping-pong around the spiral, with each insurer passing the loss onto their reinsurer. And this is exactly what we saw in the late 1980s, a perfect storm, to excuse the pun, of catastrophes. We had the storms in the UK and Northern Europe of 87, the Piper Alpha oil explosion in 1988, followed by the San Francisco earthquake and the grounding of the Exxon Valdez tanker in 1989. The combination of these disasters caused losses to spiral out of control, circulating through the system over and over. They didn't just double or triple, they multiplied exponentially as they bounced around the syndicates. To make matters worse, many underwriters didn't fully grasp what they were getting into. The policies were priced way too low, not realising the potential for massive losses. The result? Lloyd's of London was nearly brought to its knees. Between 1988 and 1992, Lloyd's suffered staggering losses of £8 billion. The market nearly collapsed entirely.
Right, Damian, we're by the corner of the Royal Exchange. We can see the Bank of England beside us. I love the fact that the iPhone that we're recording on has logged this location as Mr. Lasagna. So shout out to William Taff, who obviously was on SKADI's recent podcast about cyber. And it is William's favourite restaurant whenever he comes down to London. So there you go. Very, very topical to be here.
And a lot of coffee houses, funnily enough.
And that's the other thing, Dave, isn't it? We're right next to a number of coffee houses.
We've literally walked past about 5 or 6 in the last 20 feet. I mean, there are hundreds of them around.
But these are the modern day coffee houses where...
Yeah, not many candles being burnt, I would guess.
No, not many candles. Are there any contracts being done? Are there any off-channel communications happening in these coffee houses? Oh, controversial. Anyway, but it's at this site and sites around it where, under the Society of Lloyds...
It really put down... Society of Lloyds put down its roots, and became, in a way, the Lloyds that we would know today.
Yeah, and recognise it. And I think also, what is clear from the history going forward from here is also Lloyd's importance in terms of intelligence.
Yep.
Gathering of intelligence, through things like the Napoleonic Wars. Shipping remains integral to the business of Lloyd's. But aside of that shipping, there wasn't really much insurance or risk-taking outside of the UK. And I think, we could talk a lot about the history of Lloyd's. It would fill many, many podcasts. But I think there's a couple of really pivotal moments that we can talk about, and while we're here near the Bank of England as well. So I think sort of pivotal things really is,
you sort of talked about the internationalisation, so I'll get there in the end. But there was, a drive into the States, into the United States, that's occurred during this time period. And as I think you're about to allude to, one of the key time periods around that was the great earthquake in San Francisco in 1906.
And that's right, and this sort of brings us back to one of the threads that we were talking about while we were walking the streets over here, is how fire becomes so linked into and interwoven into the history of Lloyd's, because it was with that particular earthquake, and not just the earthquake damage but the associated fire damage afterwards, that prompted many of the US insurers to point to clauses in their contracts and go,
we're not
sorry,
cover this,
we're not, you're not covered. But great fanfare, great sort of pride in Britain. Cuthbert Heath stepped up and said, we will honour
we'll make
all
good
of our
on
contracts.
all our contracts, yeah.
And that's a massive call, but a really great commercial call, because that call established Lloyd's international reputation.
Correct.
Where it was recognised that if you had an insurance, or you had your insurance with Lloyd's, they would stand up. And that's been so important for the strength and recognition overseas of Lloyd's as an export. And then the other sort of pivotal moment, I'd say beyond that, again, US impact, but Hurricane Betsy.
Yes.
In 1965, which caused £50 million sterling of damages. That was a huge impact on the Lloyds Names, and we haven't talked too much about the Lloyds Names, obviously the Lloyds Names podcast, but it's the fact that you have this funding of an insurance market or underwriting of an insurance market underpinned by individuals and their savings.
Yeah.
And that scale of losses, £50 million, was enough to really cause a drain on the names that historically had been in Lloyd's, and really presented a problem, because by this time, Lloyd's had become, systematically important, I would say.
Yes.
You could recognise it as a systematic institution. And here we are overlooking the Bank of England in the late 60s, a notorious report commissioned by the former governor of the Bank of England, Cromer, the Cromer Report. And that has been the subject of controversy over the years, hasn't it, Damian?
It has, yes, and I don't think it's ever been fully released, or was it not? It wasn't released to the names, certainly at the time, in the 80s, is that correct?
Yeah, so I think it was commissioned kind of late 60s, but only really for the management of Lloyd's, and never released to the names. But I think what it recognised was that Lloyd's needed to draw in new sources of funds. I think one of the controversial elements in there was there recognition of the risks coming from the US? Again, going back to the fire, the theme of fire, asbestos losses. Asbestos, obviously, being a great fire retardant material, but obviously then found subsequently to be very, very dangerous, when inhaled. So, was there a recognition in that report too? But what you had was people, a new set of names coming in to Lloyd's, and a drive to get a new set of people in. And the other thing that was providing that drive was tax.
Yes.
The high rates of tax in the 70s, Damian.
Yeah, I think didn't we see income taxes for high earners up to 98%, something eye-watering like that? So there was definite call for ways and means to attempt to get around that, of which Lloyd's became a conduit.
Well, this is, and capital gains tax, I think, as well. Very, very high rates, which may be topical given the fears around, some of the fears around what the budget could hold for second property holders, for example, in the UK, at the end of October. But, I don't think it was particularly that Lloyd's was sort of touted as some kind of, government-approved tax shelter, but I think what they did very well was financial engineering. They had worked out a system by using gilts, because there is no tax on gilts.
Capital gains tax on gilts, correct.
And so they managed to engineer a way of recognising income by way of using gilts. And that's kind of, an interesting theme in terms of Lloyd's. But this brought in a number of, really a new class of names. So people that were wealthy, but really had no experience or knowledge of the kind of risk that they were taking in this market.
Yeah. So you had an unlimited liability, really. So, and that was one of the big problems that we saw. Absolutely.
And again, I think also the other ability of you being able to kind of not double count, but the fact that if you pledged money against Lloyd's, it wasn't taken in by Lloyd's.
Correct. Yeah.
So this enabled you to, get your revenue in from Lloyd's, your income in from Lloyd's, but still use that capital elsewhere, have it employed elsewhere. And so that was, again, an attraction for people that were really trying to boost their own incomes. Okay, well, we're back in the office, Damian. That's, I think we said, that was the first time we've done an outside broadcast. We've been down to West Sussex to have a look at, some of the, get a feel for the housing, where people lived, the real people affected, the real Lloyd names, Lloyd's Names. Have a real look at them, and then we've also got a feel for the timeline, the story, and a gallop through the history of Lloyd's.
Yep.
But it wouldn't be a SKADI podcast without a little bit of, takeaways, thoughts.
Yeah, exactly.
What do we get from this story? We definitely think that there's a lot of evidence that there's poor suitability of product and poor client care. Risk management and record keeping, I think we've identified as well. I mean, clearly a huge risk management failing, and you've talked about the LMX spiral, and I've talked about reinsurance to close, and people's misunderstanding or lack of knowledge around those. And then finally, you talked about the baby syndicates as well, the sort of the insider dealing elements as well, and the conflicts of interest and business interest. But let's take it all back. Let's go back to the suitability and client care issue as the first one. And a lot of this really goes back to the Chroma report, which we did mention in our dash through the City of London. Yeah. And I think I incorrectly referenced it in my excitement to talk about it. But the Chroma report was commissioned by Lloyd's.
Correct, yes.
And who was Mr. Chroma?
So he was a former governor of the Bank of England, and the commission was done way back when in 1968. And we've had a bit of a dig around to find if we can find said report in a PDF or some such format, and it is not out there in the public domain. Now, bits of it have been leaked, bits have been surmised, but the document does not exist out there in the wild. So it has been kept under wraps by Lloyd's.
And that is an area of controversy, because ultimately the Lloyd's Names story ended in litigation, or there was an element of litigation at the end.
Yeah.
And the point being that it wasn't possible to litigate against Lloyd's, the institution, unless they could prove, the names could prove fraud, correct?
Correct, yeah.
And so that's where the kind of, I won't want to say conspiracy theory, but the suspicions arise around, what exactly did Chroma know? What did Lloyd's know at the time? But certainly there are aspects to Chroma's report that I think are probably quite, pretty good. It certainly identifies, issues around the conflicts of interest, which we can talk about later. But just going to,
what happened. Chroma identified, as you said, that they needed to source new liquidity for Lloyds.
Yeah.
And I think we said this out on the road. We got to this point where a lot of capital was leaving Lloyds.
Yeah.
And so they had to encourage new capital in. And they also went for...
Well, what they did was there had been very onerous capitalization requirements that names needed, and they looked to reduce those to just increase the number of people that could come into these syndicates. So they looked to widen the membership massively from people not just in the UK actually as well, globally, and also reduce the capital requirements that would need to come in as a name.
And that's really quite stark, isn't it? Because you relax the requirements, and do you do that in the knowledge of risks that are in the pipeline? And that's the question.
Yeah.
Because that's pretty bad form, to say the least.
Yes.
If you know that there are issues coming down the pipeline, which is what the Lloyds Names suspect, don't they?
Correct.
That a lot of the asbestos issues, for example, were known about but not necessarily revealed to people. So bringing these new names in, did they understand, and I think they clearly did not understand, aspects of the accounting at Lloyds, the reinsurance to close, the fact that they could be exposed to prior years of syndicate or counting periods of syndicate,
prior decades. And, some of these had been rolled and rolled and rolled from the sort of 1920s, 1930s. These asbestos claims and the like. So
So, we don't want to bang on too long about this, but it should be clear to anyone listening who's in the control functions, obviously suitability, knowing, whether your customer is really able to understand and suitable for the products that you are offering them, the investment strategy. That's why we spend so long, focusing on that, whether we're in audit or compliance review work, but also in investigations after allegations have been raised. A lot of our work focuses on, what was the business sending out to its customers?
Yeah, what checks were being done beforehand?
What were sales telling people? Were they being balanced with the risks, and so on? And then the next one which should be quite obvious given the scale of losses and the fact that there were repeated losses year after year that all came along at once. And you could say it was unlucky from the respect of the time and what happened, but really it looks like a risk management failing, which is kind of interesting from an institution that really deals solely in risk.
Yeah.
And should understand it so much better. But I think as you've explained, with things like the spiral, there was a lot of not understanding the risks in the pipeline. And why was that in particular?
Indeed. Well, it's this sort of this whole excess of loss policy. So, for instance, I think they worked out at the time. So, Piper Alpha, which was a famous catastrophe back in, I think it was 1988. I think that was one of the largest single insurance claims ever made, and I think the total charge to Lloyd's was estimated to be $1 billion. But the claim triggering of excess loss policies, which triggered other policies, etc., the total of those claims came to about 16 billion. So that shows you the sort of magnification of the loss within all these syndicates that one single event, obviously a very large event, caused.
One oil rig which effectively exploded, killing many workers on board. It was significant, but obviously not to the tune of $16 billion at the end of the 80s. That's just a vast sum of money. But as you say, the initial charge of $1 billion to be magnified up to 16 billion. Round and round again. And why is it the case that happened back inside Lloyd's? Why did it keep going back inside Lloyd's?
Well, I think it's just as we described. It's just the resending of risks around to other syndicates again and again and again.
And also, it's the time period too, right? Because we're talking about the end of the 80s.
Yeah.
You know, we're all sitting here in 2024 with fantastic systems, although we moan about them, fantastic records and access to records.
No, absolutely. I suppose, and as you think, you know, we were starting our careers back then, and I certainly remember it was still pretty paper-based, even back then. And imagine going, there's a claim from the 1930s that's now been rolled through many times. Where's the record of that? It's not sitting in some database that you can kind of query, etc. Excuse me.
Well, shout out to Barbara Gottschalk, who was the librarian at Baring Securities, Damian. Do you remember her?
Yes, I do.
I remember you used to go into the library and she would accost you as to what you wanted because it was about paper records and access to research. We were working. I remember when I started. We were still on green screens and Lotus 123.
Yeah.
So go back and another 10 years, if you like. Where were you there? So record keeping was a weakness in this. It wasn't possible to identify readily what risks each syndicate had taken and taken again.
Yeah.
And again.
And again.
And again.
As you say,
yeah. So that was the other aspect. So of course, we focus on risk management, and it's a good lesson, for any market, whether it's Lloyd's or whatever, the business of taking risk, whether risks are modelled correctly, and that's why there's so much focus on model validation. That's why when we found rates on the increase 2 years ago or so, that invited a lot of problems into banks, because a lot of the models were not really roadworthy for the market conditions that we were in.
They may have a 5-year look back window, but actually that covers interest rates are zero and not much else. So that's a big issue in a model. That just show why you need to be doing stress testing, etc., to look back at periods of history where things did go awry, and then does your model cope with that? Or it's that classic thing where if you price something up and you look at it and you need to really stress test it to make sure that what you would think that the outputs you'd think should come out if you double rates, if you put oil down to $5, whatever, come up with the results you'd think. It's very important to all this model testing and stress testing that has to be done.
And then I think that the last thing that we've identified is insider dealing and insider risk, and that's a terrible story. Within Lloyd's. You talked about the baby syndicates. You talked about the dustbin syndicates. I mean, how awful, to have a term like that, to really show the kind of the attitude and the derision towards people. And as we said, the Chroma report did identify that. They did identify that there were conflicts of interest within Lloyd's that needed to be corrected. There wasn't an awareness or a line of sight over people's own individual business interests and how they were taking them, and the access to information. And of course, again, we focus a lot on information barriers. We focus on, who's got access to what information, need to know principles as well, and what, where conflicts arise, identifying them. And that's not, again, none of these things are unique to Lloyd's, but what is, I think, beneficial about looking back at something like the Lloyd's story, which is, very different from wholesale finance, but at the end of the day, it's about the business of risk and what goes wrong, control failings on a number of fronts, and, what the result can be. Any other final thoughts?
Well, yeah, it was just touching on that. It's that whole issue around information asymmetry. The whole point was the insiders, the people in the baby syndicates, the old school names, I suppose you would call them, knew a lot of information, whereas the outsiders didn't. They had, it's that classic of, when people came in and started coming in, obviously it was a very profitable trade. So that was sort of became self-fulfilling. And it's that classic of, the trade that keeps working well sucks more and more people in. But actually there was a lot of information asymmetry. People didn't, a lot of these new names just didn't know what they were in, apart from the fact that it seemed to be a sort of one-way trade that was constantly making money. And that's always that classic sort of, if it's too good to be true, it probably is. And that's, a lesson that still is carried through to this day, I absolutely believe.
And I think you found a good article that kind of summarised this point about
it's a fascinating article from a journalist in the FT, John Kay, who wrote this article way back in 2007. So this is pre-Lehman's crisis. Actually, we looked up the date before jumping on this. This was just after BNP had closed and looked to shut down a couple of funds, which was if you look back at the Lehman's timeline, it's the sort of first wobble that we saw. And in fact, markets did sell off quite aggressively. And I think the ECB pumped a lot of money into the system to sort of keep things going. This
was in the summer. It's August 2007.
Yeah, but you think that's a long, everyone the GFC is 2008,
Yeah, so Lehman didn't go till over a year later.
But the genesis of the article is it refers back to the Lloyds Names story while looking at the current 2007 era with all these CDOs, etc., all these sort of financial products, financial wizardry that had gone on, and sort of surmises, keep your eye out. And in fact, it's a very prescient article, although we did sort of say, a great signal to be shorting the market if when this article came out, you'd have been squeezed horrendously.
Yeah, the market roared back, it did a roaring correction. But he says some interesting things, doesn't he? He talks about the assumptions behind how risk is distributed in the market versus what actually is the reality. And what does he say about the distribution of risk in the market? He talks about it being shared amongst a wide number of stakeholders, or that's the assumption.
Yeah.
But the reality is, due to information asymmetry,
that it wasn't being
that it ends up being borne by the people that know the least.
Exactly, yeah. So actually, to quote from it, it's a great paragraph he's written here. So the paragraph goes, greed mingled with self-delusion, honest incompetence with conscious deception. It was impossible to say which had caused the crisis. Lloyd's was, I came to realise, a microcosm of what was happening in other financial markets. If trading was motivated not by differences in attitudes and preferences, but by differences in information and understanding, risk would gravitate to those not best able to bear it, but to those least able to comprehend it.
Well, this has been really enlightening for me, coming out on location for this podcast. Damian and I normally sit in the studio with Alexandra and we talk from within the square mile. Obviously not in the square mile, we're down at Canary Wharf, but there is a danger when you're working in finance that you just become so detached from the reality of all of the different areas that you're financing. That's what the financial industry does. It provides support to allow innovation, and that innovation supports the creation of so much. And really, when you come and step outside and come down to a place like this and see where people that are affected by the decisions and choices that financial professionals make within the industry, whether it's insurance or asset management or wholesale finance, serving private clients, serving institutional investors, ultimately, the impact of those decisions finds its way into the lives of the general public. And it's really stark coming down, seeing this here in this small town in Sussex by the coast. You can see, quintessentially English gardens. It's all very, very quiet, all very, very calm. Really poignant.
You've been listening to the SKADI Podcast, featuring Nic, Corry and Damian Taylor. This podcast is produced by me, Alexandra Mexi. If you found today's episode interesting, you want to be a friend of the show and interact with like-minded people, you should join the SKADI Discord. Our chat community is a big treasure trove of information where you can find all the materials we use to produce our podcasts. If you want to listen to more episodes, then simply search the SKADI Podcast on any streaming platform. Feel free to connect with us at SKADI Limited on LinkedIn to read about our research and business relation to anti-financial crime and control functions. Until next time, thank you for listening.